everyone, welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain, and what we're doing this week is we are talking about a concept of trying to be makne davar shelo ba le'olam, literally trying to transfer ownership over an item that has not entered the world. Now, interestingly enough, there seem to be three different types of this concept. One type of this concept is what we see in Bava Batra, Kuf Mem Bet Amud Aleph, which is the impetus for giving this year, this week. And that is that the person who's supposed to acquire the item is actually not yet in the world. In other words, the case of Mizakeh Leubar, a person trying to give an acquisition to a fetus in utero. Literally, not the item being lo ba le'olam, but the acquirer being lo ba le'olam. A second example or type of davar shelo ba le'olam is indeed what the pshat of the terminology sounds like, which is the item itself that is meant to be acquired has not come into the world yet. And in fact, behind me, for those watching on video, you'll see a line of trees, because your classic example of trying to be makne davar shelo ba le'olam, meaning an item that doesn't yet exist, is for me to say, see these trees that I own? When the fruits start to grow in, I'll give you a bushel. Or when the fruits start to go in, I'm selling you a bushel. But those things don't exist yet. Can I actually make a kinyan? Is that actionable, right? Does it have teeth? A third version of davar shelo ba le'olam is actually when our transaction is based on a situation that does not yet exist. So for example, if a man says to a woman, you are mikudeshet to me once I convert to Judaism, right? He's not Jewish now, but he is trying to make a transaction, so to speak, different kind of transaction than the other two, of course. He's trying to make a transaction that is based on a condition that does not yet obtain. All three of these are considered devarim shelo ba'u le'olam, whether the item doesn't exist yet, whether the acquirer is not yet out in the world, and whether the condition on which the transaction is based does not yet obtain. So I want to see all three of these for a moment in the Gemara itself, in different places in Shas, and then I want to talk about the logic behind why it is that a person does not actually transfer acquisition of something if it doesn't exist, or if the acquirer doesn't exist out in the world, that is, or if the conditions for the transaction don't yet exist. So let's take a look. Okay, first, our Gemara, right? D'amar Rabbi Yochanan Bava Batra Kuf Mem Ben Amud. D'amar Rav Nachman, excuse me, sorry. Hamazake le'ubar lo kana, lekesheteleid kana. If somebody is trying to give something to a fetus, that kinyan doesn't happen. It's not effectuated. But if they say this is given to the fetus l'ksheteled, when the woman gives birth, kana, the kinyan works. The Rafuna says no, af l'ksheteled lo kana. Even if they say, I want this kinyan to take effect when she gives birth, the kinyan does not take effect. Now, Rafuna, it's clear he doesn't think that you can be makne davar shelo ba le'olam. He just doesn't think that you can transfer ownership to something that doesn't yet exist there out in the world. Even if you say this kinyan is only chal, it's only effectuated when the child is born. Lema'aseh, this child right now is lo ba le'olam. Rav Nachman's a little trickier to understand, because it's possible that Rav Nachman also thinks that you can't be makne to someone who's not in the world yet. But it could be that he thinks that an ubar, even though they're literally not in the world yet, could be that an ubar already is not quite defined as a davar shelo ba le'olam, because it's not non-existence, right? So it's hard to understand exactly what Rav Nachman means, but Rav Huna is pretty clear. If the acquirer doesn't exist out in the world yet, the kinyan doesn't work. The Gemara in Yevamot Tzadik Gimel Amud Aleph gives us our classic example of davar shelo ba le'olam when the item itself doesn't yet exist. The example that I mentioned, to Itmar, here's what was stated: Hamocher peirot tekel lechavero. Somebody's selling the fruit fruit of a palm tree to their fellow person. Amar Rav Huna says, and it's interesting, they're actually flipped here, Ad shelo ba'u le'olam yachol lachzor bo, until the fruits actually come out and bloom or blossom, whatever we say, grow, whatever we say for fruits, a person can renege. Misha ba'u le'olam ein yachol lachzor bo. But once they're out, you can't renege. But Rav Nachman says, no, af misha ba'u le'olam yachol lachzor bo. Even once they come out into the world, you can renege because in adam makne davar shelo ba le'olam, right? And I'm going to pause there. So the fact that Rav Nachman seems to change positions in the situation of Bava Batra, saying for an ubar, if you say once the ubar is born, the kinyan works, but with the mocher peirot, even once the fruit is out there, you still can't, you still can renege because in adam makne davar shelo ba le'olam makes it seem like in Bava Batra also in the case of the ubar, he also thinks in adam makne davar shelo ba le'olam. He just thinks that an ubar is not strictly davar shelo ba le'olam. That's for a different time. Either way, those two conversations, those two examples, the acquirer doesn't fully exist or the item doesn't fully exist. The third, where the situation on which the transaction is based doesn't quite exist, comes from a Mishnah in Kiddushin, number 3. The Mishnah in Kiddushin, Parak Gimel, Mishnah Hay says, Ha'omer le'isha, if a man says to a woman, Hared mekudeshet li lachar she'et gayer, you are betrothed to me once I convert to Judaism, O lachar she'tit gairi, or after you convert to Judaism, lachar she'eshtachrer, or after I get freed from my slave status, O lachar she'tishtachreri, or after you get freed from your slave status, or, Nabal said, lachar she'amut ba'alech, after your husband dies, or after your sister dies, or after your brother-in-law gives you chalitza, none of these things work to create kiddushin. And interestingly enough, here we're not talking about an Amoraic dispute between Rav Huna and Rav Nachman, but we're actually talking about a Tanaitic source that's talking and makes it sound like the kiddushin, which is a legal transaction, does not take place because it's based on a situation, shelo ba le'olam. Nobody's sister died yet. Nobody's husband died yet. Nobody gave chalitza yet. Nobody became a ger yet. Nobody was freed from their servile status, right? Is there anybody who says, actually, in this kind of case, yes, you can be makne davar shelo ba le'olam? So that's what the Gemara comes to talk about. The Gemara in Kiddushin, Samach Bet Amud Bet Samach Gimel Aleph says, Amar Abaye, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Rabbi Meir, these 3 Tanoim, Kulu Svirlahu Adam Makne Davar Shelo ba le'olam. All 3 of them actually think that a person can transfer ownership over, at least in this situation, a scenario that hasn't come into reality yet. But it sounds like also the other 2 scenarios possibly, right? Where the person doesn't exist yet, the acquirer doesn't exist yet, or the item doesn't exist yet. And the example given for Rabbi Meir, how we know that Rabbi Meir thinks that you can be makne davar shelo ba le'olam, is Tanya is a breita rather than our Mishnah, which said chad v'chalak very clearly. If a man tries to betroth a woman, after for some future time when some new situation obtains that doesn't obtain now, that kiddushin doesn't work. Apparently, there's a breita where that's not a unanimous view. Tanya Omer leisha haret mekudeshet li lachar she'et gayer, lachar she'tit gairi, lachar she'eshtachrer, lachar she'tishtachreri, lachar she'amud ba'alech, lachar she'tamut achotech, lachar she'yachlot lach yevamich. All the examples that we saw in our Mishnah, Eina mekudeshet, she's not mekudeshet, but Rabbi Meir Omer mekudeshet. Rabbi Meir says she actually is, right? So 2 things that are interesting about this. One, we're expanding our understanding of what is a situation of davar shelo ba le'olam. It's not just if the acquirer doesn't exist out in the world yet. It's not just if the item doesn't exist. It's also if a condition for the transaction doesn't yet exist, such as you are betrothed to me when I will convert to Judaism. That is also davar shelo ba le'olam. And the second thing that's interesting about this is it seems like there may be a machloket tanaim here over whether you can be makne davar shelo ba le'olam. It sounds like there are a few Tanaim, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Rebbe, and Rabbi Meir, who all think that you actually can. But Halakha, you can't. So let's move into the logic of why it is that in adam makne davar shelo ba le'olam. So there's 3 perspectives that are generally offered on this question of what is the logic of Ein Adam Makneh Davar Shelo Ba L'Olam. There are different versions of this, but the three that I would like to focus on. One is that when you try to give or sell something that doesn't exist yet, or to someone who doesn't exist yet, or do a transaction that depends on a situation, a scenario that doesn't exist yet, we are lacking the dot of the person who's trying to acquire these things, either at all, we're lacking it, as in the case of the ubar, or we're lacking the ability, even for people who exist and are out there in the world, to actually lismoch, to depend on the fact and to really rely on the fact that this is going to go through. Meaning we are missing smichut da'at. We are missing one of the key aspects of a transaction in Jewish law is that actually both parties have to have da'at that this is happening. In the case of acquisitions of davar shelo ba l'olam, you tell me that you're going to give me the fruits that grow on this tree. I don't know when that's going to happen. Come on, I don't think you're really serious about that, right? Or you tell me you're engaged to me once I convert. How long is that going to take? That could take a very long time, right? And certainly with the case of a fetus, there's no da'at at all, right? So the Nimuke Yosef, Rav Yosef Chaviva on Bava Batra Samach Vav Mabet, he explains this very nicely. He says simply, lo mahani, it doesn't work, mishu de lo samchadate, because the acquirer doesn't rely, isn't relying on what's going to happen here, meaning doesn't trust that this is what's going to happen. And interestingly enough, there are some people who suggest that if you're looking at this as the whole thing is an issue of smichut da'at, does the person basically believe you that you're actually not going to renege? People take the example of Yaakov and Esav. When Yaakov buys the Bechorah from Esav with lentil soup, and they notice, Vayomer Yaakov says to Esav, Hishavali kayom, I want you to take an oath to me that you're selling me the Bechorah, Vayishavalo, and he did so, Vayimkor Bechorah to Yaakov, and he sold his Bechorah to Yaakov. And people say, why does he need the oath? He sold it. What's the oath for? So, of course, this is anachronistic because these halachot, davar shelo ba l'olam, didn't exist in the time of the Torah and in the time of the Tanakh. And yet, the Ritziv says, Hishavali kayom, I want you to swear to me, Esav, that you're not going to renege. Basher bechorahu be'emet davar shelo ba l'olam, because the bechorah, because the firstborn ship is something that is not out in the world yet, right? It's like when Abba, it's time for him to give the Bechorah. That's something else, but it's not now. V'iyafshar limkor, so you can't sell it. Al kain hosif lo sheyishava shelo yachzor b'mechira. And therefore, he makes Esav swear that he's not going to renege. Meaning, because essentially Yaakov's saying, I don't believe you. It's a davar shelo ba l'olam. I don't trust that this is actually going to happen. It's not right here, right now. You can't give me something tangible. Therefore, I don't have smichut da'at. I don't trust that this is going to happen. So therefore, you have to take a shvuah and an oath. That's binding. You won't be able to renege, right? An oath doesn't require my smichut da'at. Once you take an oath, that is legally binding. That's an interesting logic for this. A second approach is actually to say, in a situation of davar shelo ba l'olam, specifically, we might say a situation of where the item doesn't yet exist. One of the biggest issues is, say, is ein ba'alut. There's no ownership yet over it. The person who's trying to be makna, the person who's trying to transfer ownership from themselves to someone else, doesn't yet have ownership over it. So it's interesting to note that the Rambam, where he talks about the laws of davar shelo ba l'olam in Hilchot Mechira, Parak Kaf Bet, Halakha Hey, where he at first in Halakha Aleph had brought the example of where the item doesn't exist. In Halakha Hey, he says davar she'ein birshuto shel makneh eno nikneh, something that is not in the possession of the one who's trying to do the transfer is not considered acquired. V'harehu kidavar shelo ba l'olam. That is like a davar shelo ba l'olam. Ketzad, how so? If somebody says, Masha irash me abba, that which I will inherit from my father. Machur lecha is sold to you. Masha ta'aleh mitzudati min hayam natun lecha. Something that will come up in my, trying to go fishing in the river is given to you, or sadeh zo l'she'ekachena knuya. This sadeh, when I buy it, it is acquired by you. Lo kana klum. There's no kinyan that happened here, right? So in some ways, by comparing this situation to a situation of davar shelo ba le'olam, it's possible that the Rambam is also shedding light on the logic of davar shelo ba le'olam. Just like if you didn't own something because it wasn't in your possession, when it doesn't exist yet, it also isn't in your possession. But to be honest, that logic doesn't work so well if we're talking about a situation where the person doing the acquiring doesn't exist yet, right? Meaning, because if it's all about the ownership of the person who's giving the item, they do own it. It does exist. It's in their hands. So it may not be able to explain everything. Another explanation that I think is really intriguing is actually just to ask, is there anything upon which the kinyan actually takes effect? Meaning, if you don't have anything there that already exists, for instance, right? Does the kinyan take effect on anything? Does it have to actually be chal on something? So the Levush, for example, Rav Mordechai Yafe, says the issue is she'ein kan davar she'echol alav kinyan. There's nothing on which the kinyan can take effect. And so what he says is, by the way, this is why there is a way to get around this. For example, of a im machar ha'ilan leperotav. If instead of saying, I'm selling you the oranges that are going to grow on this tree, instead I said, I'm selling you this tree, but only for its oranges, right? Then kanam yad gufa ilan leperotav. That other person actually acquires a stake in the tree, but only for its fruits. Ve'en echad mehem yachol lachzor bo, and neither of them can renege on this transaction. So that's kind of interesting because it's giving it's creating a situation where you actually have something on which the kinyan can be chal, right? It's saying something about the formalism of halachic acquisition, that it's not just about my da'at meeting your da'at, right? It's not just about my brain meeting your brain. And it's not just about me transferring my ba'alut to you. It's actually there has to be something done on the item itself, on something itself, right? We're I would say we're somatic, we're bodily beings, right? We have bodies, we are material stuff. We are not just brains and desires, right? And so this approach to why in Adam Makna Davar Shelo Ba Le'olam, that focuses on the need to have something on which the kinyan can be affected, is really interesting. Now, I will say that there is a kind of slightly different version of this, which is a version that says, well, it's actually a little bit more that there has to be like this would only apply in situations where we would require something to be done with the object that is being acquired. So, for example, if it's an item that requires either kesef or shtar or chazaka, right? Those are items where we actually need something physically to happen in order for the kinyan to take place. And none of those things can happen whether the person doesn't exist or the item doesn't exist. The conditions not existing, that's a little bit tougher, but they can't happen. There are kinds of transactions that don't require any physical movement or motion, And for example, Hekdesh might be one of those situations, right? Consecrating something to Hekdesh might be one of those situations where maybe even if you don't have the item, you might argue, even if it's a davar shalabala olam, you might argue that if the logic is because a davar shalabala olam, there's nothing on which the transaction is going to be chal. Well, in a case of hekdesh, we say just saying that you're giving it to hekdesh is good enough. So maybe you don't need an item on which for it to be chal right now. Whereas if you said that the logic behind ein adam makneh davar shalabala olam is because you don't own it yet, then I could see that you also shouldn't be able to give something to hekdesh that you don't own yet, right? Meaning that doesn't exist yet, and therefore you don't own it. Or if there's no smichodat, question is, would that apply in the same way to hekdesh? Do you need a smichodat, or are we saying we just don't think that you're serious? So either way, what we've offered here are three different logic models for why ein adam makneh davar shelo ba le'olam. One relying on the da'at of the koneh or the konah, the person who is acquiring. Another relying on the lack of ba'alut, the lack of ownership by the person who is claiming to give as a gift or sell something. And a third is the issue of there's nothing on which this kinyan can actually fall. And it's kind of interesting to suggest if you were to make a list of all of the invisible forces or all of the invisible ingredients that go into a transaction of transfer of ownership over something, I'd imagine that you'd probably have people's intentions or mental states would be in there. I'd imagine that you would have actual ownership in there. And I would imagine that you would have an object or an item in there. So in some ways, it's kind of choosing different pieces of the picture to figure out which of those seems to be ma'akev, which of those seems to be kind of do or die. If you don't have it, that was a prerequisite and the kinyan doesn't work. Thanks for learning with me, everybody. Looking forward to next time.